Hello and welcome to the Why the Mountains podcast with me, your host, Stephen Farley. Apologies for how late this episode is. Unfortunately, Storm Dara knocked out my broadband last Friday, which is over a week ago now, along with a large number of trees and more around County Wicklow. If anyone from Sky Broadband is listening, it would be great to get reconnected at some stage in 2024. But anyway, this is the first part of our interview with Jason Black, renowned climber and mountaineer from County Donegal in the northwest corner of Ireland. If you love the mountains and have never been to Donegal, you're missing out on a real treat, and I highly recommend a visit. Jason Black is a professional mountain guide with his own company called Jason Black Mountaineering, based out of Dunfanaghy in County Donegal on the edge of the Glenveigh National Park, home to Mount Errigal, a magnificent 751-metre mountain and well worth a visit. The views from the peak, if the weather is kind, are spectacular. We begin this interview, as we always do, by asking Jason, why the mountains?
Oh, big story, long story, maybe, but a beautiful story for me personally. My love for the mountains was born out of Cubs and Scouts at a very early age, growing up in rural Donegal, right out on the coast. My mum and dad introduced me to Cubs and Scouts. There was a neighbour's car that was leaving to go into the Scout Hall, and I found myself in it, and that journey continued for a lifetime. 7 years of age, it started out, and as like most young, curious boys in the 80s, and I think the blessing in disguise for me was I was introduced to these fabulous leaders. Maurice Graham, God rest him, who's sadly passed on, Daisy McConnell, and Darren and a few others, and they left a huge mark on my life. They introduced me to the great outdoors. They introduced me to the rivers and the lakes and the mountains. Their culture back then in scouting was to be outdoors as much as possible. So we didn't really stay in the hall. If we were in the hall, we were doing treasure hunts outside. We're learning about map reading at a very young age, doing knots and stuff like this. And I just absolutely fell in love with it. I had that, curious adventure mindset as a young boy. I was constantly on adventure. Even at home, I would be on my bike and I'd be gone lost for hours. Mum would be going crazy looking for me. Wouldn't eat for hours and hours and hours and nearly forget to eat. And I was introduced to this in a manner that they were able to teach me these skills, and it was a baptism of fire for me. And I'm still a scout today. I don't think it ever leaves you. I think that curiosity about nature and exploration stays within you. And there's part of me still. I'm 7 years of age, and I have that curious exploration inside to explore the planet.
Not for the first time in this series, we hear about the amazing positive impact that being a member of the scouting movement can have on young people. I am a scout leader myself, so biased without a doubt, but there is no denying the fact that scouting at its best takes young people on their first steps into a lifetime of adventure that, for Jason, led to the highest peaks in the world. I asked Jason a bit more about the dedicated women and men who volunteer with the Scouts.
Yeah, I think, the power of leadership, you can't underestimate it. I get the opportunity today to talk in schools and to talk to groups, and I remind leaders that your words and your has a massive influence on young people. And for me, when I look back, those leaders had a huge impact on my life, not just as a mountaineer, but just in life in general. They had instilled in me the skills and confidence to get out there and get at it. And it was amazing. When I look back, about, as a young 10-year-old boy, I've been taught how to bivouac outside with no tent to learn how to navigate. Like, I don't know the day that I learned how to read a map and a compass. It's a bit like, when did you learn to walk? I can't remember. It's the same as map reading. It's because it was instilled in me so young as a young boy. And that survival instinct was put into me, how to cook outdoors, going to the jamboree, how to socialize, how to engage, how to find my way around, the Baba Job as well, going out and doing chores in the community for locals, and understanding the how to engage with older people in the community and look after them. And I think a lot of the big culture for me that came out of scouting was respect. I think, that's what scouting put into me. When you had to turn up in your uniform, you had to turn up in a certain way. Your scarf had to be folded in a certain manner. You had to present yourself in a certain way. And there was an ethic around scouting as well. You presented yourself and you executed a kind, gentle, caring community activist, even as a young boy. And I don't think that's changed in me today. I'm still out there in Africa and all these countries around the world building schools and trying to make a difference through adventure. So I think that was all very much born from scouting. So when I look back, it didn't just lead me to the summit of the greatest mountains in the world. It gave me such a skill set of manners, respect, courtesy, and empathy. Um, that has served me so well to this day.
I should use that section as an advert for my scout group, and as a scout leader, it's wonderful to hear the movement spoken about in this manner. The scouts clearly set Jason off on his path to Everest without him even realising it. Bob Job, however, is going back a bit. We are both betraying our age with that. I asked him about some of his earliest experiences in the hills. Turns out the scouts were a little more hardcore, perhaps, back in the day.
Yeah, again, back to the leadership of Morris Graham and Daisy McConnell. These guys were, they were so adventurous. When I look back today, look, I was 12 years of age when I done the West Highland Way, which is 8 days in Scotland from Glasgow to Fort William, climbing Ben Nevis. We had there wasn't a weekend that we weren't out climbing. Went and done Boots, which was down in Carntool. I think I done Carntool for the first time when I was 9 years of age, and I'd done it in snow, which was up past my knees. Um, every single morning down there, they would have you out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning, and you had to do a 3K run and back for breakfast. And then during the day, we were doing loads of training and there was just I was involved in the Shannock Adventure, and then I got onto the Shannock Adventure development team through Morris as a young teenager, and Ian and Zeph Klinkenberg and those guys introduced me to map reading, and setting out courses, and it was just it was a real baptism of my fire right through my life. So the question about the mountains, once I had kind of Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales done, I think I had Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales covered before I was 15 years of age. All of them. I'm not talking about just Mickey Mouse. I mean, every single Munro in Scotland, every single mountain in Ireland was bagged at 15 years of age. So they had lit a tremendous fire inside me for mountaineering, and I didn't even know what mountaineering was. I mean, I was running around in an old steel framed rucksack, wearing, in some cases just what mum and dad could afford. And back in the 80s, that was very little. There was no technical gear that we have today. There was no, we were running around in a pair of tracksuit bottoms. We weren't running around in these lovely, beautiful trekking gear and technical gear that we have today, but it was brilliant, because I didn't put value on material things. My value was in nature. My value was in exploration, and, for to spend, 12 years of age to spend 3 days out in the mountains didn't cost me it didn't cost me a second, and like later on in life, I went through a lot of battles in life. It was really that carried me through. That really, the ultimate survival of to stay on the planet came from back then. So yeah, to Ben Nevis at 11, 12. I'll never forget it. The Munros up through Scotland. In tough conditions. They weren't just like, these weren't fair day experiences. This was in at the sharp end of the stick. So brilliant experience. Back to Morris in particular. I'll never forget it. He had a Honda Accord car. He was a milkman, and he would put myself and Clive Davison and a few others that had showed massive interest, and he would pay fuel costs, overnight accommodation, because he could see the sense of like exploration that was inside us, and it probably matched him. Morris was ex-army himself. He spent a huge amount of time in that world. And he had obviously benefited from it hugely, and he just could see the curiosity in our eyes. So yeah, look, I mean, it was brilliant, and he brought us to the jamborees. Uh, any opportunity, there wasn't a weekend we weren't in the car heading off to do something, and I know that scouting has changed today, and the world of scouting has changed today. They're not as outdoory as they used to be, but I'm back in today working with scouting and trying to help influence that culture again, trying to encourage them to get back outdoors. Never a more poignant time with mental health issues that are currently around the world at the minute, because again, I think today, looking back at my battles, I think it was nature that helped me.
No doubt Jason had built solid mountaineering foundations from a young age, and by the way he speaks about it, as he comes back to later, the idea of being out in the mountains, out in nature, was extremely important to him as a young person growing up, and indeed would remain so later in life. I asked him a little bit about when he decided to venture a bit further afield.
There was never a thought process about it. There was this natural journey for me. Um, Once I had got Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, at this stage now, I'm pretty committed to that space, and I did struggle with society, because what I didn't see was I had become this outdoorsy person. I don't know if you could put a title on it as a young age. I call myself a mountaineer today. Back then, I was just in love with nature and everything. The curiosity of wanting to kayak, run, bike, hike was, it didn't have to be just about hiking. It was about anything to do with nature, fishing, building bivouacs, building fires, camping outdoors, cycling the bike for days and days and days, kayaking, loving the rivers, lakes, and mountains. Um, that just continued and continued and continued. And then the curiosity about beyond Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales became real, and I wanted to experience. And then I could see, conversations that were happening about Mont Blanc. And then I was like, okay, about this Mont Blanc, being the highest mountain in Europe. I was really reading magazines and listening to stories from Dawson Stelfox, who was a massive influence for me. I'm going to come back to that. Like he doesn't know the power of words, and what he said to me one day, that really flipped the switch for me. And that I'm going to come back to that, but I had got the opportunity. Again, let's go back to a time there was no money, and I couldn't afford really much, and I was living off goodwill. Um, I got a chance to go to France. It was my first baptism into the big mountains, and I went over and I took my small tent with me because I couldn't afford to stay in the even the hostels or the hotels. So I went over and I camped at the base of Mont Blanc. It was really cold, really really cold. It was probably minus 15, minus 10. I'll never forget. It was Baltic, and I didn't have the gear, and I was climbing, and I was I was just I was just trying to do some work and to learn how to climb. And I was trying to pretend that I knew what I was doing as well, because he had all these very accomplished French mountaineers, English mountaineers, and all these other enthusiasts that were there that possibly had money. They had all the gear and they had the equipment. They had crampons and ice axes and stuff like that. Stuff that I didn't even know what it was, really and truly. And I remember one day that I got a real kind of I got a real lift. There was a crowd of climbers that had been climbing an ice section uh, in round the base of Mont Blanc, and I was there, and I was trying to see what they were doing, and the guide kind of spotted that curiosity in me. And whenever he had finished the group up a little bit early, and I had kind of gone over, and I was kind of hovering about, and he brought me in. He was an English guide that was living in Chamonix, and he said to me, what was I doing? I explained, that it was from Ireland, and as this young lad was keen about the outdoors, and was keen to learn about snow, and it was my first time. And he said, look, well, why don't let me show you? And he spent some time showing me how to ice climb, and how to understand snow and the purchase of snow and how snow's layered. And then that curiosity just grew and grew and grew, and I kept returning back every year to the same guide. And then we went through the Mont Blanc tunnel, went into Switzerland, and went to the Cognac area. And again, I couldn't afford to be there. I didn't have any money to be there. The transportation to get out there was just enough. My backpack was full of food from the supermarket as opposed to clothes, because I had to carry every single piece of food with me because I couldn't afford to go to the restaurant for food. And that I was living off the scraps of guiding, because I couldn't afford a guide. And these guys would just give me an hour here and an hour there, and taught me how to do my first, ice climb, how to do my first, how to learn everything about it, how to cut, a slab in ice and understand avalanche, to my first, mountain rescue training, to learning how to wand, to, all these skills that were just brand new to me. And as a young teenager, I'm kind of in my mids, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20s. This is me in my very early days, and I'm getting this real baptism of fire on the next level. So that was kind of it, Steve. That was kind of this natural journey for me, and then it led itself on then um, to being in Letterkenny one day, and getting information that Dawson Stelfox and the Irish team were successful on Everest, and the first Irish team to be up, and they were doing a tour of Ireland, and they were coming to a local school in Letterkenny, and I was struggling at that stage. I was going through a real youthful depression at that point, at the hands of just society, really, because I was the square peg in the round hole. I was this young guy that was doing alternative things and not playing Gaelic football and soccer, and and not really, conforming to society back then. I was kind of off doing my own thing, and I was kind of deemed kind of like odd. He's odd. There's something wrong with that lad. He's different. And all I was just, was just pursuing what I loved in life, which was nature. And anyway, Dawson was doing a tour, and they had come into a local school. So I'm sitting at the back, and I'll never forget it to this day. In fact, I actually have on my wall, as part of my certificate for climbing Everest, I have Dawson Stelfox. Dawson Stelfox had a pamphlet that he was handing out with photographs and a bit of a story about the Irish journey. And I was in the audience that day, and I was sitting in the back, trying to be cool, swinging on the back of a chair, and he was speaking about Everest and the journey that they had, and and also the trials and tribulations they had gone through in order to get there, and the journey with trying to get equipment in there, and food and Sherpas, and the climb itself. And I was just blown away by it, and I was awkwardly hanging about afterwards whenever everybody was leaving, and Dawson seen that, and he kind of brought me into a conversation, and everybody left, and it was just me and him, and I was just so enthralled by their journey, and the fact that he was the first person there, and what was that like, and just that accolade, and just the whole thing. It was just mesmerized. I was mesmerized by it, and asked him would he sign the booklet for me, and he did, and I took the booklet home. I thanked him, and I took the booklet home, and I didn't open it. And I was sitting at home, and I opened the booklet. I was reading through the photographs, and reading the small information that he had inside on paragraphs about the climb, and he signed it, Jason, always follow your dreams in life. And he didn't even sign it Dawson Stelfox. He just signed it, Jason, it's important to follow your dreams in life. And that didn't really mean a lot to me then, but it meant a lot. It means a lot to me today, and it hangs in my home on my wall in my sitting room, right next to my certificate, and a piece of rock from the summit of Mount Everest. And I have the whole lot framed. And that, when I look at that, that whole thing, circumnavigates my life, because the people that influenced me, the leaders, the coaches, the guides that invested me, Dawson that inspired me, those words of inspiration, his journey, his leadership, his, the fact that he's been there himself as, as a leader in Irish mountaineering, and then, it's just incredible. And, he didn't finish it there, because he ultimately heard that I got up, and then he wrote to me. And, to get a letter to your home from Dawson Stelfox saying, Jason, I heard you got there. It's just, for me, it was like the whole journey, the whole compass had gone 360 degrees. And I know I'm jumping through hoops and I'm missing parts of the jigsaw puzzle, but, and in essence, the leadership that people have in their life, it can be so powerful to a young boy, a young girl. And I say that today, when I'm talking to football coaches, or I'm talking to scout leaders, or I'm talking to influencers in society, that your words and your actions can have a powerful impact in young people's lives.
It's amazing, the goodwill of strangers sometimes. and how much that meant to Jason, learning how to operate in the higher mountains and terrain of the Alps, learning brand new skills all the time through the formative years. And then, as we have heard before, the impact of the success of Dawson-style fox Frank Nugent and the 1993 expedition. As we know from hearing from Frank and Dawson earlier in the series, they were aware their success was important for Irish mountaineering in general, but they were having an incredible impact on young people who would be the future of Irish mountaineering. Jason spoke a little more about this.
You know, I'm sure he has inspired a lot of Irish and international climbers, and even in general people, you know, that have pursued their own direction in life. But I genuinely would love, and I know he's a very humble person. I know he doesn't generally gravitate to the magnitude of what he achieved, but he was the inspiration for me. You know, he was one of the cogs in that wheel that turned, you know, so well in my life, you know. And yeah, I'd love someday, you know, Hannah Shields as well. You know, she wrote to me as well when I came back from K2. And you know, those people, you know, they were my idols. You know, they had their own battles to get where they needed to get to in life. But you know, as a young boy, as a young man, you know, to have those, you know, they were the innovators. They were the people who were out there first. You know, okay, they may not have been the first up there, but they were the first Irish up there, and that means something to me. You know, that holds gravity in my space. You know that, and you know, so yeah, someday, somewhere along the line, when I get the courage, I'm going to sit down and explain to them, you know, the power of their wisdom and words that day was definitely instrumental in my success.
Hannah Shields we will hear from in a future episode, and having just spoken to her, she is a wonderful person and her kindness to Jason is not a surprise. I asked Jason about when Everest really started to come into the picture.
Again, a young man, didn't have money, um, you know, big borrowed steel to got there. It was really got in there, got to see Everest for the very first time. I was 60 miles from Everest when I got to see it first. And, you know, it's very hard to explain to people the size and scale of these Himalayan mountains. You know, I had no idea. I thought a big mountain was Carntoul and Mont Blanc. You know, that was kind of like my perception of an 8,000 meter mountain. You know, I don't think the visual impact from a magazine or from TV does it any justice. It's not till you stand in at the footsteps of these magnificent giants you really realize the magnitude of what they are. So then, you know, I've been in there and I started a whole journey. I was 8 years in Nepal training and basically lived in there with my Sherpas. These are my beautiful friends to this day. These are the people I go and sleep in their homes, the same homes that welcomed me in back then. So yeah, I'm in there and I'm trying to find my way through Kathmandu, the madness of it. I'm staying in the hostels. I'm trying to befriend some climbers from Nepal. I'm trying to find my way, and then I get into the Himalaya. So much so that I couldn't get out of it because I couldn't afford to get a flight back out again. I had to walk back down again. It took me nearly 2 weeks to get back down again. But I'm in there just trying to learn my craft. I'm in there. I don't have money really to even buy permits. You know, I'm again at the mercy of goodwill gestures. And my first big climb in there was Island Peak, in the Himalayas, and you know, I loved it. I got in there. I am, you know. Mirror Peak was my next biggie after that. You know, again, I'm not part of a team. You know, in some cases I'm in there on my own. I shouldn't really be in there. Some of the permits didn't allow me to be where I was. But I was just pushing on. The curiosity of exploration was why I was there. And then again, you know, the Sherpa community welcomed me in with open arms, brought me into their homes, let me sleep in their floors, gave me food from empty cupboards, you know, and fed me and looked after me. And this is back at a time where mountaineering wasn't huge back then. You know, it was back at a time where we didn't see the numbers that we have today, you know. So I'm walking through the Khumbu and I'm in different regions in Nepal. and I'm going from point to point in villages that, back then they weren't expensive. You could stay in a very moderate, you know, um, amount of money and get fed and climb. And it's obviously exploded into this huge commercial enterprise that it is today. But back then, you didn't need as many permits for the mountains. Every single mountain in there today, you need a permit from the Nepalese authorities to be on the mountain. But back then, for me anyway, I was maybe I was doing the right thing or the wrong thing. I was exploring away. So then, came back down one day into Nepal, and I was waiting to get home, and I had 2 or 3 days before I could fly home, and I was just kicking about Kathmandu. I was staying with one of my Sherpa friends, and I went into one of the Sherpa shops, and I met a guy called Nima Gumbu, and we sat on the floor, and he took out a big thermos flask, and we started drinking tea, and I was telling him my story, and I was looking at a pair of 8,000 meter boots. I was so curious about it. It was a second-hand shop. Nima he was surviving with his family um, of equipment that was being given to him by explorations. He was a Sherpa and guide, and people would be leaving expeditions, and they would give him the boots, or they give him jackets, and then he had a small second-hand store in Kathmandu, and that's what he would sell in order to keep himself and the family going. So we sat on the floor, and I told him that I'd love someday to be able to climb Mount Everest, but I think I don't know how I would do it. And he says, "Look, maybe I'll help you on that journey." And that was he instilled that same back to that same Dawson Stelfox and Morris Graham moment. He instilled that belief system that it's possible, and just give some give some context to who I was dealing with. Nima Gambu was, whenever you're in Kathmandu, or sorry, yeah, in Kathmandu today, there's Everest Beer. There's a climber on the front of it. That is Nima Gambu. He was responsible for supporting climbers during the big accidents in Everest and that early expedition. I can't remember the exact date that it happened, where um, um, again, it's gone out of my head, but he's very, very hugely accomplished a mountaineer and Sherpa in Nepal. So anyway, long story short, I left. I bought the boots that day. He sold me the boots. I couldn't afford them at the time. He had so much confidence in me that he said, "I'm going to leave the boots here, Jason." And I give him some money for the boots. I left the boots there, and I returned 4 years later for the boots, and the boots were still waiting for me in the shop. And they're the boots I wore to the summit of Mount Everest.
8 years in Nepal, learning his craft, trying to make his way in the mountaineering world. Sounds like an amazing adventure, but it was tough. A foreign land, a lack of money, all contributing to a bumpy road for Jason. But again, the kindness of strangers, the warmth and generosity of the Nepalese and the Sherpa helped Jason massively along the way, even though their own existence was tough too. Meeting Nima Gambu in his second-hand shop was transformative, and the boots still waiting there 4 years later. Wow. Jason goes on to talk about his early forays on the slopes of Everest, and even though he is a guide himself with a successful company, Jason Black Mountaineering, guiding people on mountains all over the world, he speaks in strong language about how Everest was changing.
My Mount Everest journey, I had been spending a huge amount of time in the Khumbu. I had been up through the icefall several times. I hadn't the permit to be there. I hadn't the permit to climb Everest. I was relying on goodwill in base camp. Base camp wasn't busy then, but I was learning my craft through the Sherpas, through the icefall, up into Camp 1 and Camp 2 on the south side of Everest. When I decided to climb Mount Everest, the prostitution of the mountain had just started. And what I mean by that is that a huge amount of money started to flow into mountaineering. And there was a lot of very rich individuals that started to come to the mountain. And for me, I felt that there was a real prostitution going on, because they were able to buy, their way to the summit they were able to pay the Sherpas to carry gear, and they were able to helicopter in, helicopter out, and all this was starting to really grow at a fast rate. And for me, you know, I had been I had been so in love with nature because she had given me so much, that I couldn't deal with the oxygen being left behind on the mountain, the ropes being left behind in the mountain, and just the way that the people, those individuals were leaving the mountain, that they just didn't care for it. And for me, I decided that I wasn't going to climb Mount Everest on the south side, and I was going to take it on in a purist manner. I had made a very clear decision as a mountaineer that I was pure in my thinking, that I didn't want to have a support system. I wanted to be able to take it on in my own terms, and I wanted to be able to climb Everest, in a pure fashion. Um, so I decided to, to really approach it in that manner, and hence the reason why I went through to, the north side of Everest, and I came in through China and Tibet. And I'd written to the Chinese authorities, who weren't giving out permits at that stage, and I'd asked them for a permit, and they sent me on to the civil aviation authorities in China, and they granted me my license to go in there. So my ultimate journey then happened in 2013. I went in through China, again, public bus, with all my gear. And I went in through China. I hired a small jeep and transported my gear through Tibet, which I found very difficult. I found it very, very alarming. I had no idea that the Chinese were suppressing the Tibetan people the way they were, and even to the point where, from village to village in Tibet, if one family member was living in one village, they couldn't go to visit their other family member in another village. Literally needed a transient permit to go from one village to another, and there was a checkpoint. And it's barbaric what's happening there, turning the water off, turning the power off. But the power of the Tibetan people it was so powerful. It reminded me of the Irish, and they're very, very proud of their culture. Hence the reason why their prayer flags was very important to them. Their dress, they would wear their Tibetan dress every day. Their religion was very important to them. Their belief system was very important to them, and I found that extremely powerful. I lived with the Tibetan people because, again, I couldn't afford expensive hostels and hotels. And so then I got into Tingri, which was the very last village, where you turn right and you go up into base camp. I took on the Rumbuk Glacier was where my base camp was set up. I went in there and got myself set up. I got hit with a storm on the way in, and I stayed in the Rumbuk Monastery, which is the highest monastery in Tibet. And I stayed there for a week because the weather was so bad. I learned a lot about that religion and culture, because I stayed in the monastery, and they were very kind and they fed me. And the head priest in there blessed me. And in actual fact, he actually came up to base camp before I set off for the summit. We had developed a lovely relationship, and he spent some time praying with me. And he gave me his blessing before I headed off. And he performed my puja in base camp before I set off for my summit attempt on Mount Everest. So, and I remember buying half a buffalo in Tingri, and buying supplies in Tingri and taking them up into base camp and setting up my tent and all my gear in there. And so yeah, incredible experience. Looking back today, a bit crazy to be honest. But it's, to be honest with you, again, back to the leadership and what was instilled in me as a young boy. It all brought me to that point, that ability to survive, that ability to have the courage to be in there and to be able to take it on my own terms was amazing.
Jason went for the north side for his summit attempt in 2013, as many others in this podcast series have done, following in many inspirational footsteps. However, you can hear from Jason how aware he was of the environment and society around him. He was able to approach the mountain on his own terms, which was really important to him. That's all for this week. Due to last week's broadband issues, I will try to get the second part of our interview with Jason out as soon as possible to catch up on where we should be. But we will see if we can get back online properly. And in the meantime, stay safe and stay cool.